I have a slide about physical protection equipment because depending on your method, it is frankly kind of scary. It can go bad on you pretty quickly. And then there's other ones that people use, like using a pressure canner. And I've actually just recently tried playing around with using a sous vide. So,
there's an idea.
Right. There's a couple things that go into play with that. One is it can be very consistent, repeatable. Unfortunately, like my sous vide only goes up to like 209 degrees. So you're not, or a pressure canner, it doesn't go that high. I mean, you can really crank up the PSI, but you're not going to be able to get up into that 356 degree mark, right? So you're limited to some degree. And then there's also, and I don't want to get into the science here, and I have a couple slides for the Ryan Carlsons of the world. But essentially, there's different chemical reactions going on when you're actually not removing water from the process. So a pot is going to be different than a pressure canner, because a pressure canner you're not really removing any water because it's all contained. So it's going to be a different product. Like Dulce de Leche, they use that as a pressure canner, but there's like amino acids in there from the milk, etc. So it's more of a Maillard reaction than a caramelization. But and I get into that a little bit, but it's really just about best practices and trying to minimize the amount of variables and how you can work within those variables to better understand what's going on and have something that is tasty. Bob, one of the best bochets I've ever had is Bob's chocolate vanilla sea salt bochet, and he uses just one pot and caramelizes all the honey the same. And I think that's just a great method. But there's also ways that you can, Hamish is talking about the black smoke. Honey that's, like I like to use the example of a marshmallow, where you put it in the campfire and you get a nice toasty, brown layer on it. That's fine, and that's beautiful. But you could also put it in too long and it starts burning and turns into a carbon acrid, piece. But sometimes that's okay. I mean, look at some of stouts, Russian imperial stouts. There's lots of beers that have acrid, bitter notes to them. It just needs to be balanced. So if you do something like that, that should be maybe like 10% of the amount of honey that you're using, depending on what you're going for, right? Yeah. So if you're trying to do some kind of like creme brulee, burnt sugar, make sure you have something. Let's just talk about a recipe formulation. You're having lactose and vanilla and a whole bunch of things to kind of counterbalance that burnt sugar, right? So I think that's the key is recipe formulation. So you can have that burnt acridness. It's just got to be really counterbalanced with a lot of sugar and creaminess and vanilla, etc. So,
Jaden's gonna love it. He's a vanilla fiend.
I think one of the things we need to look at in the industry is someone says, "What is bochet?" and the answer almost 100% of the time is it's a burnt honey mead. And I think the term burnt is sort of a bit limiting here. And yes, as you say, sometimes you do want those acrid flavors, but we need to start using the term caramelized rather than burnt, because you can caramelize it to the point where it burns, and you can also just caramelize it gently. And just because I do like the science, and a couple of things you said have made me think about it now. When we're talking about the fact that it can change from good to burnt in a split second, you said that there's a temperature at which it will caramelize. And what I'm realizing then is as you're cooking it on the stove, you're reducing the water content, which is increasing the pressure, or in a pressure canner, you're also increasing the pressure. And so suddenly you'll lose enough water that it can change temperature up to that higher temperature, and that's how it will burn so quickly in that regard. But Bobby Slans is just correcting me here. He's saying burnt and scorched are different. So we can apparently still burn our honey and only have it caramelized, and scorching it is when we get the black smoke.
Yeah, it's to your point about the more. To use an example for like a steak, for instance, a lot of times they always talk about, taking the meat to a hot pan first, before putting it into, let's say, a crock pot with water and everything else, or into the stove with some kind of liquid, because that Maillard reaction happens in the absence of water. And I think that's a similar type of effect with the caramelization of sugars, right? So the more or the less water that there is, maybe now I'm taking a note here, I need to show a graph, kind of that logarithmic scale of how that gets away from you quicker with the absence of water. So the less and less water, the quicker it's going to burn, right? If you put honey without any water into a crock pot, it's going to take a long time. But if you put, let's just say, a cup or two of water in there, it's going to take days before that thing caramelizes, because it's got to reduce all that water out of it first before it can start caramelizing.
So it's
the water's sort of acting like a brake staying at 100 degrees. The water part can't actually overheat because it evaporates. You have to wait till enough of it evaporates out, and the honey itself can increase temperature up to a burning point. It's like wet wood won't burn.
That's
and
getting
dry
into
wood
basic
will.
candy making.
Yeah, that's true. It is a basic candy thing, but I hadn't really put it through with bocheting honey. I hadn't really put it into the candy making thing, and how quickly candy will go from a soft crack to a hard crack, and it just sort of just happens. But anyway.
Almost all my references for the presentation are from candy. I mean, there's some stuff from Ken Schramm's book, etc., but a lot of it's just from candy makers and different kitchen science references. So,
have you ever made caramel?
Oh yes.
You're basically, I love making caramel. It's best stuff ever. But it's basically you're doing a very similar thing. And I've been like kind of mulling over. I've got an Instant Pot, and which is basically it's an everything. It's a crock pot, it's a pressure cooker, it's a rice cooker, it's a everything. But anyway, I use it as a pressure cooker a lot, and I'm thinking, if you were to put honey in a pressure vessel, it's holding in the steam, i.e. the water, and it's putting the honey under pressure, but I'm not seeing, it just seems to me like it wouldn't reduce properly because the water is not escaping until you're done.
Well, it won't reduce, but the extra pressure given by the steam increases the density of the honey, allowing it to heat up that little bit more.
Okay.
Because at higher pressures, you can get it to higher temperatures.
No, I'm
so
thinking
it's
about taking a quart of honey and trying that.
Yeah, so it's doing a similar thing, but like Matt says, and he's using scientific terms that I don't know yet, and I need to do some research. It uses a different reaction, and so I'm just going to listen.
Right. Well, and I think that's important, right? Is that there are different methods, but they're not all equal. And you can darken your honey, and I think the term that they use is melting or decomposing your honey in the pressure cooker, but the caramelization is more of a specific term that maybe doesn't apply, but you're still going to get some of those same flavors. And I talk about some of those flavor compounds as well in the presentation and what you can expect from some of the different methods. But I think, frankly, that the most tried and true, and I guess a takeaway from this discussion is that really kind of slow and low with a thick pot. I mean, not to give too much away, but I was actually surprised my thick brewer's pot did not do nearly as well, at least from the thermal imaging, as my high-end like Williams and Sonoma candy pot over the stove. I mean, that thing was really solid when it came to not having hot spots. And whereas I thought my brewer's pot was really good, but it didn't hold up as well as I thought it would. And then obviously some other stuff. I had one of those, as seen on TV, copper pans.
Oh, yeah.
I think you're going to get the same result from one of those like cheapy at Walgreens specials versus getting something that's really well made. You're going to be surprised at the difference you're going to have, because it just can't hold. Even though your temperature, your whatever you're using to watch the temperature of the honey may seem the same, you're going to have a different product just because of the hot spots that are going to be spiking up over 350 degrees, and you're going to get those acrid notes that just aren't very, very desirable.
These pots you're talking about are they stainless steel, are they?
Yes. The one,
Okay.
well, not all of them, and that's the other thing too, is that you can have different reactions as well, depending on what you're using. In fact, that's the other thing I talk about, the reactions. I mentioned pH, but there's some things in just the impurities of the honey, and the reactions that you have with the different metals. All of these things can change the reaction speed of the caramelization of the honey. So it's all things that, frankly, I have an hour, and I'm not a great molecular mind, but in the same token, these are all things that I think you can watch out for and take a look at in terms of, wow, that didn't really work. Maybe I should use a little bit better pot than this thin aluminum pan, So I think that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, my gut feel is that even the cheap pots, if they're going to be ceramic, even the cheap ones, it's hard to screw up. They should be nice and even. Did you find that? Have you found any ceramic pots that weren't good from your hot spotting or your thermal imaging?
No, well, frankly, the only pots that I used that were ceramic were the crock pots, and they were great. I mean, that really worked the best. The only problem is the time. So
yeah.
With a nice stainless steel Williams and Sonoma type pot, that thing, I can get it up to caramelization and down and cooled within 30 minutes, where a crock pot could take 6-7 hours to get that same result.
Yeah, and speaking of which, Sergio is asking, what's the difference when you caramelize at around 250 in a slow cooker versus bringing the honey temp up to your 340 plus?
In terms of how long you keep it at that temperature, I think you're going to get more caramelization. So the amount, and they're all kind of rules of thumb, right? So at 230, that doesn't mean necessarily that that's the hard stop. You can get caramelization before 230. It's just really the point at which the graph really starts taking off in terms of the reaction for that specific sugar. But the longer you keep it at that temperature, the more that all of the molecules, all of the sugar is going to be more caramelized. So and as a result, and that's the note about the graph, the more that the water is being expelled from the honey, the more that it's going to. If you were to continue to add water to it at some set rate, at whatever the evaporation rate is, perhaps you wouldn't see any more caramelization. But and that's the whole point about the pressure cooker versus just an open pot. You're really going to have, the more that the water is expelled, the more that it's going to caramelize.
Okay. Sergio says he just picked up a 55-gallon steel drum with 2 band heaters. They go up to about 450 Fahrenheit. Going to try heating it only to around 250 for a longer period of time.
Yeah. Yep. I think those band heaters are a good way to do it. I don't know. I think there's 2 ways that you can do it at large scales. It's some kind of like heating instrument that you insert inside of the drum, or those band heaters, which would also heat the drum itself. So I don't know much about those drums themselves, but you would eventually heat all of that honey to a certain point. And fructose, again, is at 230. Dextrose is at 320. And maltose is at 356. So those are kind of some of the bigger. Sucrose is a small portion of honey at 330, but it's kind of that 230, 320, 330, and then 356. So you're going, depending on what you want to do, and frankly what honey it is. So Tupelo is going to be a lot higher in fructose than some of the other honeys. So it would, it's kind of where you want to sit in that range.
Well, it sounds like.
So if we take, sorry.
I was just going to say, it sounds like it's not a bad idea, at least on a commercial level, to maybe have the honey you're considering bocheting analyzed for sugar content to, be able to do the math to get a better idea of the ideal bocheting temperatures.
Yeah, perhaps, or you could just use that composition as a general tool. I mean, because they're all honeys are going to be plus or minus maybe 10% in that range, but it might be something to consider if you want to back off of one honey versus the other the next time you try it. I don't know, but especially when it comes to wildflower, because frankly, I got to imagine that's over 50% of all the honey produced is wildflower.
Yeah.
So, and I'm guessing most people aren't spending a lot of money on meadow foam to bochet or caramel.